Hello and welcome to Compare and Contrast RWE guidelines across decision makers, including HTAs. As we wait a few minutes for further participants to join, I will share a few slides with you about this webinar and the society itself. This webinar has been developed by the Real World Evidence and Artificial Intelligence Interest Group. The importance of real-world evidence, RWE, in health technology assessment is increasing over time as technological advances have given rise to innovative tools for collecting and recording information and for generating and synthesizing evidence from a wide variety of settings in the real world and oftentimes even in real time. We'd like to thank you for being an HTAI member and remind you that as a member, you are invited to join one or more of the HTAI interest groups. To learn more about our interest groups, please see a link that will be in your GoToWebinar control panel. Participants throughout the webinar will remain muted. To submit any questions during the webinar, please use the questions functionality on the GoToWebinar control panel. This may look like either of the two images shown on the screen, depending on whether you have joined through the app or web browser. A Q&A session will be facilitated during the final portion of the webinar. Thank you again for joining us. I will now hand things over to our host to formally welcome and introduce today's webinar.
Thank you very much, Brace, and thank you all for joining. This is a pleasure to be among you. Let me see. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen already?
We can see your screen, yes.
Excellent. Okay, perfect. My camera, I think it's now also working. So, welcome everyone. I'm Masoud Tousi. I'm chair of this real world evidence and artificial intelligence interest group. And I welcome you all to this seminar, to this webinar, basically. Before going to the presentation of our presenter, I would like to introduce you a little bit our interest group and also let you know why we have established this quarterly webinar, because we are going to have one of these webinars every quarter. So next slide doesn't work. Yes. So in terms of this, in terms of the interest group, we have established the real world evidence and the artificial intelligence interest group with the aim of providing and changing the dynamics regarding the real world evidence and artificial intelligence generation, and also appraisal of that within the HTA process. Our objective is to provide a network for everyone who's interested in this topic to communicate, to collaborate, and also to participate in thought leadership projects among the different members of HTAI. And our remit is actually providing three things. First of all, a forum and catalyst for change. And we want this interest group to become a place where people can exchange ideas and also build relationships and educate each other. And we also would like to provide you some education about this topic. And of course, another objective that we have through this interest group is to facilitate resourcing and capacity building for common projects in such a way that members of HTAI who are interested or who are working on these topics are able to provide to collaborate with each other and find the right people for their projects. And so with this being said, we have a number of activities ongoing. We have a project which is ongoing about stakeholder mapping. We have in some newsletters that we have, that you have probably already received. We have a monthly a letter that we send to you for communication. And we decided in the steering committee to also establish these quarterly calls. One of the most important reasons we wanted to have these quarterly calls is also to communicate, of course, and to build a link between, you know, the steering committee and also those who want to present and different members. The other objective is also to foster collaboration and innovation, because we think that through these webinars, that we want them very interactive, you will be able to communicate, and this will also facilitate innovation. And finally, the last but not the least, one of our objectives is also to provide our more junior colleagues and members of HTAI, and don't be shy in presenting your topics of interest. We will be happy to give you the podium and invite you to present your topics of interest. For example, if you have a PhD topic to present and or any other research project, you are welcome to reach out to me or to reach out to any of my colleagues for the presentation. Now, talking about my colleagues, again, I think there is a technical, yes. Let's see about this technical. So I presented myself, and I would like to invite my other colleagues also to present themselves, so you can know the steering committee of this IG. Elena, Dimitra, are you available, or Lorena, present yourselves?
So they are not available to speak currently. So if you'd like, you can just introduce.
No problem. Yeah. So this IG is actually composed of the 4 people in the steering committee. Lorena is the technical officer, and Dimitra and Elena are co-chairs, and you have this information. You have the emails here, and you're of course welcome to contact them. Now, as the last point about for this webinar, I would like to say that I'm really happy and honored to present Ashley Jaska, who's scientific partnership lead at Aetion, and her role focuses on forming partnerships with regulatory and HTA agencies to enhance their use of RWE, to support their decision-making and set methodological guidelines for RWE generation. I would like to thank her also to be the first person who's going to speak on this. And we have run and had some discussion about the topic, and I'm sure you will enjoy her presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Masood. I think we will try to work on getting my slides queued up here. Give me one moment. All right, hopefully you should be able to see my slides. Again, welcome to the webinar. I'm honored to be here and to present and be kind of the first person to present to the RWE AI working group. So as Masood was saying, my name is Ashley Jaxa, and I am the Scientific Partnerships Lead at Aetion. And what that really means is that I lead engagements with HTA and regulatory bodies, and with the goal of assisting them in setting standards around the use of RWE and around their standards around generation of RWE. What do they expect? What is high quality RWE to them? I also work with biopharma customers to help develop RWE that, of course, is going to meet the needs of those regulators in the HTA bodies. I wanted to quickly introduce my company just to give you a sense of our perspective and why we actually did this research project that we're going to talk about today. So Aetion is a data analytics platform provider. And what we do is we ingest pretty much any type of real world data And through intuitive, transparent, and scientifically validated workflows, we turn that real-world data into real-world evidence, which can be used by anyone who is interested in scientifically rigorous results. And we are mainly focused on making sure the science is right. And so that's why my role is to really help organizations define what our good RWE looks like to them. What does good RWE mean? And so today I want to focus on some work that we did in collaborations with authors from NICE, Amgen, and the EMA around RWE best practices and setting standards for RWE use. But first, I think it probably makes sense for us to level set on where does RWE really fit into reimbursement decision making. Then we can turn and look at the status quo for RWE best practices. And then we can focus in on where gaps may exist in those best practices and postulate how we can fill those gaps. To level set very quickly, when I'm going to speak a lot, of course, about real-world data and real-world evidence, and what do we mean by those two terms? So real-world data is data related to the patient's health status and/or the delivery of healthcare that is routinely collected from EHR, claims, registries, and so forth. And through data science, that RWE is transformed into real-world evidence. Now that we have a quick kind of intro of definitions, let's first take a look at where does RWE fit into HTA decision making, and why are we so interested in RWE for decision making at this time point. So there's been an increase in clinical uncertainty at the time of launch, time of drug launch, and likely this is due to programs that try to speed up access for patients to get innovative products. And this uncertainty really impacts an HTA's ability to evaluate the value of products. So in terms of what types of uncertainty we're seeing, so we're seeing a decrease in drugs that were approved on at least 2 pivotal studies. We're seeing an increase in surrogate endpoints and an increase in the use of single-arm studies through the regulatory approval process. And of course, that information then trickles down to the HTA, who must evaluate the value of a product based on potentially less clinical evidence than they had been used to seeing for drugs that have not gone through the accelerated approval process. So where are these uncertainties, and where can RWE kind of help bridge the gap? The graph on the right here comes from a study that attempted to categorize and quantify uncertainties that were mentioned by regulators and HTAs in their evaluation of the clinical evidence package of 33 different drugs. And the blue bars represent the regulatory agencies. So you can see the FDA is on the top, the EMA is on the bottom, and then the orange bars represent HTA bodies. And for the US on the top, it's ICER specifically, and then on the bottom, it's a collection of EU HTA bodies. In the sample of the 33 drugs that were evaluated, there was a high levels of uncertainty in certain kind of groupings or certain types of categorizations. Population was one of them, so that would be kind of uncertainties around the generalizability to clinical practice, or relevant subgroups may have not been adequately captured. Uncertainties around comparative effects, and uncertainties in the outcomes. And you can see that a lot of, in these cases, the HTA bodies mention more uncertainties than the regulators. So the orange bars are larger than the blue bars. And the idea here is that, one, there are uncertainties when a drug comes to market, comes to launch, and these uncertainties can be categorized in these certain kind of groupings, so population, comparative effects, outcomes. And we really think that RWE can help reduce some of these uncertainties across the drug's life cycle. So now that we kind of level set it on why we might need RWE, how can we use RWE in HTA? And there are a number of opportunities, both pre and post-launch, for RWE in HTA decision-making. So I adapted this slide or this chart from numerous sources that are cited there at the bottom. But if we think pre-launch, RWE can really help answer some contextual questions around the drug coming to market. So for example, what is the current standard of care? How are patients treated? What are their treatment pathways? What do the patients look like? RWE can also provide inputs into cost effectiveness models or budget impact models by looking at costs or event rates. And then we can also think about RWE potentially being used as a contextualizing efficacy. So if you think about external control arms, for example, and that's pre-launch. If we think post-launch, this is kind of where a lot of focus is today around this idea of looking at a drug a couple of years after launch and looking at the comparative effectiveness of that drug in the real world. And that's, of course, obviously one large kind of question that RWE can help answer, but there are other questions post-launch. So, very specifically, how is the therapy used in the real world? What indications is the drug being provided for, or a script's being provided for? What dosage? What's the treatment length? Is the drug used in combination? How is adherence, and so forth? And so this is kind of just a landscape view of where RWE can be used in the HTA process. And HTA agencies have often used RWE. This is not a new concept. RWE and observational studies have been used by HTAs for quite a while, but they've only been used by HTAs in certain buckets. So for example, cost effectiveness and budget impact modeling inputs are one area where RWE has been used a lot among HTA agencies. But HTA agencies are now becoming a bit more open to expanding their use of RWE. And so let's take a look very quickly. If we look at two agencies, again, there are a lot of HTA agencies, and we've just selected two here as an example. But if we take a look at NICE, for example, they stated in 2020 an intent to use real-world evidence. And they have further solidified the role that RWE is going to play in their decision-making in a 5-year strategy that they actually announced last week. And so NICE is currently working on, they have a whole group that is currently working on setting methodological standards to incorporate RWE in their guidance development. ICER here in the US is another agency. In their 2020 value framework, they laid out how they were going to use RWE very specifically around some reassessment pilots. And we're actually partnering with ICER right now, looking at drugs that were approved through the accelerated approval process by the FDA, 2 to 3 years post-launch. Can RWE help answer some of the uncertainties that ICER noted in their original assessment? And so right now, one of the pilots we're working on is HAE, hereditary angioedema. ICER reviewed that in 2018. We're reviewing it using real-world evidence, and we're expecting results in July of 2021. So these agencies, again, are contemplating and trying to figure out how they want to use RWE and what requirements RWE should have in order for it to be used by the agency in their decision making. But these agencies are not starting from scratch, right? There's a body of literature of best practices for real-world data and real-world evidence generation. So how can these agencies and other agencies across the globe really tap into that information as they're trying to set their standards? And really, that's what our goal was. So if we take a look at the amount of publications that attempt to address RWD and RWE best practices, one question comes up is, is there a consensus among these recommendations? And if I'm an HTA and I'm attempting to set our own standards for how we're going to use RWE and what level of quality that RWE has to have for us to be able to use it, I'm going to first go to this published literature, but it's a bit of a patchwork, and so it's hard to necessarily make sense of all these RWE publications. On the flip side, if I'm a manufacturer or a researcher trying to develop a high quality RWE that's going to be accepted by decision makers, what are the standards that I need to meet in order for my information to be informative? So again, this is what we set out to do. Along with colleagues from Amgen, NICE, and the EMA, we wrote a paper that attempts to make sense of all the disparate recommendations on RWE coming from key stakeholders. And we organized the documents into what we're calling a comprehensive structure or organized structure. We then summarized the documents and summarized the recommendations, and we identified gaps in those recommendations. And this paper is currently in pre-publication and should be posted online ahead of print pretty shortly. And it's coming out in the June 2021 issue of the Journal of Comparative Effectiveness Research. And so the findings of this paper are what I really wanted to focus on today. Because we were interested in decision makers and their standards for RWE, these decision makers often self-publish their guidance documents. So we first started with a gray literature search of key regulators, HTA bodies, research initiatives like, for example, GitReal, or professional organizations like HTAI, and then some US government organizations. And the goal here was to identify documents that provided recommendations on RWE best practices. And we read all of these documents and we extracted the key objectives, what the document was attempting to do, and the recommendations, RWD and RWE recommendations within those documents. And what was interesting is that there were a number of themes that came across. And these themes typically followed a typical scientific process from study design through study evaluation. And we considered these building blocks for high quality RWE. So we organized all of those recommendations into what we would consider these building blocks. And the building blocks followed that typical scientific process from, again, study design to final report evaluation. And that scientific process really makes up the meat of this sandwich here. So for example, if you take a look at the study design building block, within study design, there were a number of recommendations that talked about how to select a fit for purpose design, and a number of publications or recommendations that talked about how to develop a great protocol for your RWE study. On the data sources side, there were recommendations around how to judge data quality, and then how to define fit for purpose data. Analytical methods, fit for purpose methods, what methods should be used in which situations, and transparency and reproducibility, how are researchers attempting to make sure that the study design choices, the data source choices, the analytical methods choices are clearly laid out so that decision makers can evaluate them. And then, of course, the final report evaluation. What criteria are decision makers using to evaluate the quality of these building blocks? And these building blocks were really supported by RWE use cases here on the top. And a RWE use case, this is really a statement that really outlines what type of hypotheses are relevant for RWE studies. So that might be post-marketing safety, indication expansion, and so forth. And then it was also, the meat of the sandwich here was also supported by demonstration projects. And demonstration projects were often multi-organizational efforts that attempt to address gaps or uncertainties in one or more of the building blocks. So, for example, what elements are essential in a study report in order to facilitate the replication of a study? This would be a kind of an empirical question that a group, a demonstration project would focus on. And once completed, these demonstration projects could inform and shape recommendations within the building blocks. So within each one of these building blocks, we summarize the recommendations and we identify gaps. So what was missing from the recommendations and what we think would be needed in order for us to move to comprehensive guidance. But what do we mean by comprehensive guidance? So if we were to envision what we would expect or hope for HTA bodies and regulatory bodies to issue around RWE best practices, I think the first thing to note is that we don't expect an exact recipe from HTAs or other decision makers on exactly how you should generate high quality RWE. What we do hope for is rather guardrails around making sure that elements within your building blocks are high quality. So in our paper, we proposed that comprehensive guidance has three main pillars. The first pillar being a clearly articulated, ideally consensus-based justification of the components of that building block. The second pillar would be a step-by-step process that researchers can follow to hopefully meet decision makers' expectations. And then finally, the third pillar would be a decision tool or checklist of some sort that allows the researcher both to cross-check and make sure that they've included everything that was necessary, but also for them to hand it over to the decision maker to justify their study design choices and to really kind of communicate why each decision was made and how that kind of checks the box of a high quality study. So if we go back to this organized structure for a second, let's zero in on one of these building blocks as an example, and let's walk through the recommendations and the gaps in the recommendations that we saw. And let's start with this idea of fit for purpose data. So what we did, again, is we looked at all of the documents that mentioned recommendations around what it means to have a fit for purpose data set. And then we compared and contrasted those recommendations. And so here we started with Duke Margolis. They have published Duke Margolis is a US-based stakeholder consortium that crafted recommendations that really defined fit for purpose data. And because these recommendations were the most comprehensive, we kind of cross-checked or cross-referenced recommendations from the FDA, the EMA, and Cathethan Health Canada against the recommendations for Duke Margolis. In the paper, there are a few other groups that had fit for purpose recommendations. So there's more information in the paper. Here, I'm just trying to keep it clean and hopefully concise for you. So I only selected a few groups. But in Duke Margolis's recommendations for how to define a fit for purpose data set, Duke Margolis focuses on data relevancy and data quality as the high level categories. And within those groups, there's things like the data must be representative of the patient population that, of course, you're interested in. You know, it has to have sufficient subjects. For the quality side, you know, the data has to be complete. There has to be transparency in data processing. So here you can see the checks indicate agreement with the Duke Margolis recommendations, and the text indicates kind of partial agreement. And then, of course, the blank cells really indicate that particular element was omitted from that agency's or that stakeholder's discussion of what is fit for purpose. So if you look across these at a high level, I think we can say that there's relatively decent agreement on what elements are necessary for a data set to be considered fit for purpose. However, we don't have complete agreement. We don't see all green check marks everywhere. And you know, we can start to contemplate why we might have this disagreement. So disagreement could be due to the perspective of the publication. So what is the objective of that publication? So if we take the EMA's document, for example, the EMA's document focused on evaluating and kind of categorizing the EU data sources and trying to determine, could these EU data sources be used for RWE? And by proxy, they kind of defined their criteria for what it means to be fit for purpose. But if you see here, let's take the first kind of the third column, which is the EMA column, and the availability of key data elements. You know, the EMA agreed that yes, you know, for data relevancy, it's important to make sure you have exposure and outcomes in the data set, but they missed, you know, EMA did not discuss the availability of covariates. And maybe that's because their document wasn't necessarily setting out to define fit for purpose. They kind of defined it by proxy. And we know that the EMA hasn't issued any formalized recommendations on exactly how they're defining fit for purpose. So if you're a researcher, it leaves the researcher and manufacturers to really interpret EMA's position through other publications like this particular document that we pulled out. And so, you know, it's a bit of a struggle, right? So how, obviously we would assume that the EMA agrees that covariate availability is really important, but you know, is that exactly the case? And some of these other criteria may be less meaningful for the EMA than for others, and why would that be the case? So the idea here, again, is to really compare and contrast the recommendations from numerous stakeholders on what it means to be fit for purpose. And that's just one element of the data sources building block. The next step would be that to then compare, okay, well, now we know how the agencies or the stakeholders maybe agree or disagree on their recommendations, but how do their recommendations stack up against what we would want to see for comprehensive guidance? And so of course we did this in the paper. And the first column here is our 3 pillars that we've already discussed. So that would be column 1. So that's minimally sufficient justification or explanation of the component or the building block, a step-by-step process, and a tool or checklist that can aid researchers. And then in the middle column here, we looked at specifically fit for purpose definition, right? So what do we need in terms of comprehensive guidance for the fit for purpose building block? So if we take a look at you know, the minimally sufficient justification and explanation pillar, we would hope for a consensus-based definition for what it means to be for a data set to be fit for purpose. And I think we actually have partial agreement on that. So the third column is kind of our comparison of the recommendations to what we would expect or hope to have. And I think we have, you know, we're part of the way there. There are slight disagreements in the recommendations. So we didn't see all green check marks all the way across. But I think we have a pretty good definition of fit for purpose from the Duke-Margolis group. However, it's really uncertain if global decision makers really agree with those recommendations and have adopted those recommendations for their standards of how they're going to think about if a RWD data set is fit for purpose for that particular question or not. The next thing that we would hope to have is minimal criteria that are necessary for a data set to be determined to be fit for purpose. So if we go back to the kind of criteria that Duke laid out, one of those criteria was completeness of data. So you could argue, what does that mean? how do we know if we have a minimally complete data set? Is there minimum criteria necessary? So if you're taking, age, for example, if we have in our data set, 95% of patients have age filled in, is that going to be sufficient, or is that not sufficient? What does it mean to be complete? And of course, that's probably going to differ based on if it's a covariate or if it's the outcome or the exposure. But it's important for us to kind of put some parameters around how do you meet data completeness, for example. And none of our documents did this, right? So none of the documents that we looked at, while they did talk at a high level about what is fit for purpose, they're never really defining what minimum criteria is necessary to check the boxes of data relevancy and data reliability. The next pillar, the second pillar, is a step-by-step process on how to evaluate data relevancy and data reliability, which again were the major components of the Duke-Margolis definition. And we think we're part of the way there. Duke-Margolis, in a separate publication, they recommended a minimum number of verification checks to focus on data reliability. But again, it was a very high level recommendations, and so we don't get much detail on, for example, that completeness example. We don't get much information on what is that minimum criteria and how do you know if you've checked that box or not. And then finally, the third pillar would be a tool or checklist to aid researchers and to make sure that they're communicating their decisions and their choices back to that decision maker to say, hey, we checked all of these boxes. We believe our data set is fit for purpose, and here is why. And right now, we do not have that type of a document or recommendations from any stakeholders, or at least any stakeholders that were included in our analysis. So if we go back here, just kind of to level set, we really only went through one of these building blocks, and that's just because we only have a certain amount of time today. But we looked at if there was a consensus among stakeholders in the recommendations, and then we compared those recommendations to what we would hope for or expect for us to have comprehensive guidance within that particular building block. And our paper really lays out a similar approach for each of these building blocks and each of the components. And the overarching goal is to really make sense of this literature. And so as an HTA body that is attempting to really understand and try to set their own recommendations for what is high quality RWE, we're hoping that the paper is a great resource to synthesize, everything that's been published to date, at least from our stakeholders, and to compare and contrast those recommendations across multiple stakeholders so that as an HTA body, I could say, yeah, I believe Duke-Margolis' recommendation. We're going to adopt that recommendation as opposed to reinventing the wheel and coming up with our own, or maybe we're going to modify Duke's recommendation on what is fit for purpose because we think it should also include X, Y, and Z. And as a researcher, we're hoping, of course, that our paper can help you decide on what standards you should be trying to meet when you're designing and executing your RWE studies. So we've level set on, what, at least within the fit for purpose data section, what recommendations exist and how they match up against what we would want or expect for comprehensive guidance. But now, as we noticed multiple gaps, how do we move forward? What are our recommendations as authors for us to move forward to get to that comprehensive guidance? And I think there's a few things. One, I think it's most important to prioritize building blocks that will address the concerns of skeptics. So there are a number of folks out there, and there's been a number of publications around skepticism around using real-world evidence in decision-making. Real-world evidence can be seen sometimes as a black box. And because it's not randomized, you know, there's issues with making sure to control for certain levels of confounding. So prioritizing building blocks that are going to help address the concerns of skeptics, so for example, transparency and data quality, can really help move the bar forward and help us begin to use RWE more often. And if we're using RWE more often, hopefully we're learning as we use it. So there are different projects like the REPEAT project, ISPOR, ISB. They are leading an RWE Transparency Initiative Task Force. Both of these projects are really focused on making sure we're laying out recommendations for transparency. And then you have other groups like the EDENS project that is focused on data quality. So this is kind of one idea that we had as to how do we take where we are now and move towards comprehensive guidance? Well, let's first start with building blocks that are going to address the concerns of skeptics. The next recommendation would be to build a consensus among decision makers, so HTA bodies, regulators, payers, on really what is high quality RWE. And we have a number of groups trying to do that, bringing together multiple stakeholders and multiple decision makers to help try to set standards on what good looks like. So the IMI Get Real project, ISPOR, ISB's RWE task force. Again, these are all groups that are trying to bring together multiple stakeholders and talk about what does high quality RWE look like. And then our third recommendation is to focus on demonstration projects that really pressure test the applicability and validity of RWE for decision making. So you have projects like the RCT duplicate that is attempting to, so the RCT duplicate project is duplicating randomized control trials using real world data with the goal of being able to say, okay, the RCT is gold standard. If we replicate it, if we duplicate the inclusion exclusion criteria, do we get the same result? And if we do get the same result, we can start to say, okay, well, maybe RWE can be used for causal questions within these certain parameters. So that's a particular demonstration project that's really trying to understand where and when RWE can be used and where is it valid, and how, and if it's done well, can you actually get the same results? And that, in a sense, will give us a foundation for saying, okay, RWE can start to answer causal questions. You have other groups that are collaborating, like the EMA and Health Canada, on COVID-19 and RWE research, and there's a numerous projects, demonstration projects, that are really trying to feed into those building blocks and really kind of zone in on specific recommendations in order to push the use of RWE forward. Well, we don't believe that all of this should be on the shoulders of decision makers. So, it's not the role of just HTA bodies and regulators to decide, what good RWE looks like. It's the role of lots of stakeholders. And this is a table from the RWE for Decisions initiative that really did a great job of laying out the role of different stakeholders to push RWE acceptance forward. So for the HTA bodies and payers, that's identifying questions that they think should and can be answered by RWD. It's providing some type of critical assessment of RWE and collaborating with other stakeholders to collect and analyze and interpret RWD. And for biopharma, that may be actively engaging with stakeholders. So collaborating again with stakeholders to develop and implement plans for RWD collection, analysis, and reporting. And these sound a lot like the demonstration projects. We are learning by doing, and so if we're collaborating together on certain aspects of real-world evidence and real-world data, how can we use those learnings and translate those learnings into RWE best practices? And I think through our process, through our paper, we really try to focus on making sure that we're not going backwards, we're not reinventing the wheel a lot of great work has been done. And so we need to start building off of that great work and start filling in gaps. But the first thing you need to be able to do is to be able to understand what are the current recommendations and what are the current gaps and how do we go about filling them. So hopefully that's what our paper attempts to do. And like I said, it should be coming out relatively shortly. It's going to be open sourced, and it will be in the print edition of the, I think it's June, of the Journal of Comparative Effectiveness Research. So I'm sure that I went through that very quickly, so I'm sure that there are a lot of questions and happy to take them now, or if you have any further questions, you can feel free to contact me as well. Masood, have we got?
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Ashley. This was great. I really enjoyed the discussion, and so now the stage is open for the questions. And maybe while the people in our audience is thinking about what kind of questions they have, I would like to say, about this last slide you presented, about finding areas where we can actually engage different stakeholders and building those kind of consensus-based guidelines which can encompass all of the existing local and the specific guidelines. I think RWE AI interest group can play a real clear role here. So if you or any other colleagues who are on this webinar are interested in that, please let us know. As you may know, HTAI provides some funding for this kind of project. It is, of course, it should go through a specific process, but we can take this kind of project and help you with building and connecting to other people, finding your resources, volunteers for that kind of project. And I think HTAI is a legitimate stakeholder for actually embracing this kind of project from any person who's interested in that. That was really great. Thank you. So do we have any questions?
There are some questions, Masood, if you would like to check the questions pane.
Let me check. We have questions. Yes, we have one question. There is a question actually, which is a little bit specific. Is ISPOR ISP the START RWE project?
So the START RWE template is a project that I think was born out of the ISPOR ISP RWE Transparency Initiative, as well as the repeat demonstration project. And so the START RWE template is attempting to define, it's one of those kind of checklists or step-by-step processes that we kind of alluded to around, what aspects do you need to be able to report in your RWE study? So in your protocol, in designing and implementing your study, using this template to fill in and make sure that you're checking all the boxes so that study could then be replicated, so it has enough transparency in order to be replicated, as well as a clear understanding of what decisions were made and why. So the START RWE, that was actually published relatively recently, and so it didn't actually make it into our paper, but that is a great example of a collaboration, a demonstration project that really pushes forward and gives us what I would consider that third pillar, a checklist or a decision tool for researchers as they're implementing RWE studies.
Exactly, and just to complete that, because I'm the member of that task force, the START RWE is actually a deliverable of the task force. So task force, the ISPOR ISP task force is the task force for transparency, and START RWE is a result, one of the projects which have been built in that task force. We have another project, we have another comment and question. Great talk, Ashley. Can you discuss the feasibility of setting generalizable minimum criteria for each element of the standards? Won't this be very case and context specific?
I think yes. And again, this kind of goes back to this idea of how can we have comprehensive guidance that is overarching, that isn't, very specific to, okay, for cancer, you need to have X, Y, and Z, and for diabetes, you need to have X, Y, and Z. And so I think there's probably some common ground there. There's a middle where I think you can start to look at minimum criteria without diving into, too specific that is always context specific. So, I think that's the challenge, right? As an author of the paper, I think we can try to have a wish list of what we would hope for and expect, but actually operationalizing it is a different story. So yeah, I think there are some challenges there. There will be things that are context specific, but hopefully through demonstration projects and through collaborations, we can get to the point where we can have high-level recommendations on minimum criteria. And maybe that means completeness of 80% and over for covariates is what we're shooting for. And then as a decision maker, looking at that more specific detail of exactly that particular research question and that particular data set, then there might be slight differences in how you evaluate that. But I think we can try to get to I hope that we can try to get to a situation where we have high-level minimum criteria that isn't necessarily always context specific.
Thank you very much. So I can tell you that you have a lot of questions, so you need to be a little bit quick. So good presentation, thanks. What lessons can be drawn for use of RWE for drugs from the recent COVID-19 vaccine RWE experience? For example, data quality expectations by regulators, payers, and rapidity of decisions by regulators and payers.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that's a great question. I think you could redo our paper again or update our paper with just all of the information that has come out about and all of the learnings that have come out about COVID. I think the biggest thing that we need to focus on is transparency. There's been situations where RWE has gotten into a little bit of hot water where we didn't have good data quality or we didn't have good transparency, and there were publications that came out that needed to be retracted. So I think the biggest thing that we can learn from the COVID situation is the need for transparency, the need for collaboration, and I think it just bolsters the idea of how RWE can be impactful, especially in rapid situations where we need information fast. But we have to focus on the good science, and so we have to get the science right. And through following at least the recommendations that we have to date, I think that could be following the recommendations that we have to date can get us down the road of making sure that the science is at least an acceptable quality. And from there, I think we just need to focus on transparency and collaborations with stakeholders to push it that extra mile to make sure that what information we are collecting and what information we're making decisions on is actually valid.
Thank you. Do you have a recommendation for the analytic process building blocks?
Yeah, so in our paper, there are a number of recommendations that came out about specific analytical methods to use. So whether it's propensity score matching or high dimensional propensity score matching, or other types of Bayesian models and so forth. There are a number of recommendations. Of course, there are gaps in those recommendations. So while a number of papers outlined all the different types of possibilities of analytical methods that could be used from RWE, we really don't have a good recommendation on, or kind of a decision tree of when to use which method. I think NICE has a technical document that they published, I think it's a while ago, that has a flow chart of trying to help you decide on which methods to use in specific situations. But I think there's some gaps in that. But yes, I would refer that person to the paper itself for more information on recommendations on analytical methods and where those gaps are.
Now, this one is another quick question. Could you please elaborate a little bit more about the NICE 2025 roadmap?
Okay, so I'm not a NICE representative, so I don't think I can do too much justice. But NICE, I think it was last Monday, they released their 5-year roadmap of what their priorities are across the next 5 years. In RWE, there were 3 or 4 different pillars, and RWE, I think, play a role in a lot of them. One of the pillars that NICE is very interested in is through their assessment process, they start to identify data gaps. And instead of just identifying those data gaps, NICE really wants to be an institution that sets up that type of research, so is collaborating with other outside groups to fill those data gaps. And RWE is definitely one of those tools that they're going to use to help fill data gaps that they've identified through their assessment process, through their clinical guidelines development process. So I would definitely refer that question or that person to the NICE website. They definitely have a bit more information on their strategy, but NICE is definitely focused on RWE, and they are currently in the process. There's a whole data and analytics team that is currently working on setting standards for use of RWE, both internally for the NICE folks developing guidance, as well as for manufacturers who are going to be submitting guidance or going to be submitting RWE to NICE for evaluation. But yeah, I'm not a NICE representative, so go to the NICE website for more info.
Thank you very much. I think we are 1 minute left, but I have put the best for the last. You have a person actually who's saying thanks for the detailed presentation of your work, Ashley. I'm interested in learning more about RWE specifications, blah, blah. So this is a long question. And at the end, you are invited to answer this question, but I think it would be better to take this offline. Do you have an interest in a project partnership or collaboration? So you have been able to find a person interested in what you're doing. This is really great. With this, I would like to thank everyone, all of our participants. We had more than 130 participants. This is great for a first webinar. And thank you all. And I would like also to thank my colleagues who have helped this webinar and made it happen. And thank you, Ashley. And also, I would suggest that the person who has made the question, of course, you can reach out directly to Ashley. You'll have her email here. And if the RWEAI can be a place where you can actually launch your project or collaborative project, this is exactly what we want to do.
Great. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Bye.
Take care.